welcome to you all. Thanks for joining tonight. My name is Chris Ventura and I am one of the co-founders of Harness Projects. Tonight we'll be running a two-part webinar, starting with a presentation from Jason Crane on the secret life of UX projects, shortly followed by a live UX portfolio panel review. For the new attendees to our webinars, here's just a little bit about us. Harness Projects is an education company. We teach UX design skills in a completely project-based format. We help students break into the UX design industry with real project experience, a strong portfolio, and the confidence to speak to their design process when they get into those interviews. So we will be kicking off tonight with Jason Crane, who is currently consulting as a service designer to the New South Wales Department of Education. Jason has over 20 years experience in technology and design, working with leading organisations such as NRMA, Commonwealth Bank and the ABC. Jason is also one of our mentors and will be the mentor for project number 1 of our next Career Launcher UX course starting in October. So tonight, Jason will be looking under the hood of what happens on real UX projects. We wanted to bring this topic to you to unravel some of the myths of design and to help those of you starting out in UX to understand what to expect in this career. In particular, what skills should be of primary focus when developing yourself as a designer. There will be time for Q&A at the halfway point and for 15 minutes at the end of his segment. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. You're also able to upvote other questions, so please do so, and that will help us get to the most important ones first. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jason to kick things off.
Thanks, Chris. Let me just get my screen shared so folks can see the presentation. I'm assuming everyone can see what I'm seeing, so let's get into it. So thanks very much for having me tonight, Chris and the team from Harness Projects, and welcome folks. So this part of the webinar, I guess, is aimed primarily at new to UX design folks. I want to sort of share behind the scenes of a UX project or a couple of UX projects, some of the good things, the bad things, and the ugly things. But hopefully for those of you who are perhaps seasoned designers, there might be a couple of tips and tricks you pick up and hopefully some reframes from some of the content that I'll be talking through. I'm more than happy to continue this discussion and conversation afterwards. Just look me up on LinkedIn or speak to Chris and the team and they'll pass on my details. So in terms of the agenda for what I want to talk about is there's sort of two areas I want to focus on. The first area was around the UX projects themselves, in particular, exciting things such as process, scope, your role, and what you should be focusing on. But then I also want to speak about the skills, as Chris mentioned. So when we talk about skills, I want to talk about the killer framework that best UXers use but don't share. Dealing with difficult stakeholders, using a killer skill that the best UXers have but don't share. And then the best skill. And you can probably guess there's a bit of a theme running through the skill side of things, and hopefully you stick with us and find out what they are. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about projects. So UX projects often start with a process, and this is a common process that I'm hoping a lot of you have already seen already. It's a double diamond. It's used worldwide. And for those who are new, the way it works is you have a problem space and a solution space. And you start in the problem and sort of do what's called divergent thinking, where you sort of cast your net wide, looking at aspects of problems that you want to be solving before you start to converge in to a point of view. And then you do the same thing again with the solution space. You start to explore all the possible features or ways in which you could solve that problem before converging your thinking and sort of executing on that solution. It's pretty straightforward. There are three parts I sort of want to land on this. The first part is the upfront piece, which is usually the brief that you get, or it's a business problem inside an organization. And then once you've sort of done that first diamond, you get to your problem point of view, which is where you're laser focused on what it is you're trying to be running at for the solution diamond. And then when you run through the solution diamond, you get to the outcome. So what's the thing you're releasing to the world, or what it is you've actually started to develop or test with your users. And it's a great process, except when it isn't. When you don't have any research for funding, funding for research, when the results from your research invalidate the business problem that you were running at the beginning, when the problem point of view you land on doesn't excite the stakeholders, when the solution isn't technically feasible, when the solution isn't viable, and when you can't validate your solution with the users. When that sort of thing happens, the process starts to get a bit wonky and it's a bit challenging for us to find our feet and work out what we need to do next. So often with projects and UX projects, sometimes it might seem good. You might get something like this, where a client or a stakeholder might say to you, we want a great experience, a great user experience. And you're like, great, that's exactly what I'm signed up for. I'm the UX designer, or I'm part of a team of UX designers. We can handle this. But they might also say, oh, and by the way, we've acquired 10,000 VR headsets. So the dichotomy here lies between the fact that they're talking about wanting a great user experience, but they've almost got the solution in mind as to what it is they want you to deliver. So the first takeaway is that the process and UX projects in general can be messy. The process should keep you on track most of the time, but you need to be flexible in the way in which you approach things, and to try to sense what your users' needs are and respond to them as quickly as possible. So that's why we talk sometimes about sensing and responding to what the important things are. So coming back to this particular project that I've worked on, this is what was given to us. But let me go back a little bit and tell you a bit more about the project itself. So the brief that we received from the client was around helping 5 to 7-year-olds being more comfortable around money based on Start Smart. Now, the Start Smart program essentially has these human facilitators which go out to schools, or used to go out to schools, and through role play, dressing up, games and stories, they would educate students on ways to start to know about money, start to understand how their finances work, advanced topics like how credit cards work versus FPOS cards, that sort of thing. So from a project perspective, if this brief had come through to you, would you, or did we, just build a great VR experience that mimics the real world? So it takes the best parts of what that facilitator does in that real world experience and does the similar sort of thing, but in VR? Or would you try to reverse the project and get to the right problem? So as a UX designer, this is probably something you're going to come up with in your work experience. Do you do what you're told, essentially, versus thinking about what the user needs most, or going back to the beginning and trying to find out whether the business problem actually matches what the user problem is before you start to go through the process? And so a couple of days ago, Scott Birkin, who's an author, he's written a bunch of great books. He has a background in computing science and has been writing about design and tech for quite a number of years, posted this tweet. And he was talking about this shift from a design student to a pro designer. And he talks about how design, if you're a sort of a new person, that it's about me and my ideas. So it's about just getting that job done that I've been asked to do, versus once you're sort of more seasoned or professional, that design turns into this activity. It's a creative problem solving sequence of events that engages teams, organizations, clients, and really takes into consideration the constraints of the entire world. So I think if you could keep that in mind as you're sort of moving through your UX career, this could be quite useful. So why this is important, and here's a sort of a real world example of where this comes to life, is many years ago, about 10 actually, a designer called Dustin Curtis took it upon himself to redesign the homepage of the American Airlines homepage to be more user-friendly. And then one of his cohorts, this guy by name of Thompson, decided to redesign his boarding pass. But I think the takeaway is that what these two designers failed to take into consideration, and why, even though their designs are absolutely amazing, is they're not thinking about the broader ecosystem. They're not thinking about all the things that their designs are going to impact. So it's really easy for someone to redesign a homepage in isolation, or redesign a boarding pass in isolation. But unless you understand where the printers are in the airport that might have to print out this new color boarding pass, and all the other system constraints and things that are happening, sometimes the UX design will fall short. So coming back to the scenario, we could have just built a great VR experience. So spoken to those experts, understand how they currently go about their experience, taking their what they do to the schools and sharing it with the students in the problem space. And then once you get to the solution space, build a great VR experience which mimics that in the real world. But what we ended up doing was something a bit different. This is a second scenario where if you challenge the problem, if you go all the way back and making sure you have the right problem, this is some of the things you probably have to do. So the first thing we did was we created a value proposition. So we set the North Star for the project, and we always referred back to that every step along the way. That North Star, that value proposition, wasn't hung on VR as a solution. It certainly had some tech elements in there, but it wasn't focused on VR. And it talked about essentially how we might educate the students. And that was the important part. What we did afterwards is we then engaged experts. Even though we had some inklings as to what VR could do, we were not the experts in the area. So we called up Google and got their Google Expeditions team to come in and take us through how they set up their Google Expeditions experience, just to try to understand how it might fit together. We spoke to a child psychologist to understand if he had any information around how children would react to a VR experience, especially in that 5 to 7-year-old age category. We spoke to a digital education expert, a person who used virtual worlds such as Minecraft to educate her students. And we also spoke to experts in VR outside of education, because we really want to understand things that sat outside of our domain, which might impact or inform what we're looking at. And bear in mind, this is still inside the problem space. We hadn't actually started to look at the solutions yet. What we did after that was we obviously engaged 5 to 7-year-olds. We brought them into our lab, and before we even started talking to them about VR experiences, we asked them what they were into, what their day-to-day life looked like, what they did at school, hobbies, these sorts of things. Because we really wanted to understand we were running at the right problem, and if later we decide to use VR, that was something that we could look into. Afterwards, we confirmed the new problem focus area with the stakeholder, and I've got a tip coming up a bit later on how to do this quite effectively. But essentially, did VR fit into our solution? Yes, it did, but it wasn't the primary focus. Moving into solution space, we tested this solution with 5 to 7-year-olds. And this is an opportunity to get the parents involved because they were there obviously with their children. And what we found is that the parents were actually quite engaged in wanting to be part of the process. And it was at this stage where we actually tweaked the offering and introduced the idea of a companion book. So it was a book that the parent or carer could read that would complement the VR experience of the child, making it a shared experience. We engaged experts again to make sure that we were not harming the children in any way, shape or form, given the animations and so forth that were happening in the experience. And what was really great about going all the way back to the problem and then coming all the way through the process is that not only did we get to design the UX experience of the VR part, the goggles part of the experience, we also got to help design and help set up the experience for the unboxing. So when the child took the package home to the family, what was that unboxing experience what did it look like? What was the packaging like? What other assets were included in that pack to help make that first experience of putting the phone into a VR headset a much more enjoyable and easy experience to sort of uncover. And why this is great is that when you start to pick up UX skills, soft skills and hard skills, a lot of them are transferable to things that sit outside UX. So you can use your influence that sits outside of the core experience to build great things. So takeaway number 2, UX projects do not exist in isolation. So when you're thinking about any project that you're on, even if your job is just to, I guess, produce wireframes or one small section of a UX process, you have an opportunity to think about things that sit outside of that and make an impact, or at least have the discussions with the people who need to understand what it is you're doing and how your work might impact them. This kind of leads directly onto the third takeaway, is that because you will become a UX designer, or you might already be a UX designer, your job is to be the user's champion. You must make sure that whatever it is you do is in the best interest of the user. However, you need to temper it also with what the business needs and wants. And so I've nicked a quote from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So I've talked a little bit about this VR project that I've worked on, and I'm curious to see whether you think we hit the mark or not, whether we went back to the start of the process and actually uncovered the right problem to solve, and whether our execution was good. So I'm just going to show you a quick clip as to what the end result looked like.
How can a cardboard box, a smartphone, and a koala change the way kids learn about finance? Introducing the Teleporter Adventures. Join us on a trip through the galaxy to learn financial skills in a fun new way. It's an educational storybook and virtual reality experience for kids and parents to enjoy together. Can your bank take financial education to the next dimension? CommBank can.
Cool. So, takeaway number 4. And this is probably the most important one for, I guess, a process-oriented UX approach, is fall in love with the problem. If you're always thinking about the shiny solutions, there are hundreds of different ways in which you could fix a problem or affect a problem or solve a problem. But if you fall in love with the problem, you'll become absolutely laser focused as to what it is you're trying to solve. And it opens up a lot of different solutions for you to explore. Even if you constrain to a digital space, be it an app or on the web, there are still plenty of options for you to look through in terms of the way the solutions begin to unfold. Okay, so that was the process. Let's have a look at skills. So, here's a couple of skills you need to pick up to be an expert in UX design. Can you spot which one of these is part of a killer framework? It's in there somewhere, I think. Okay, so before I move on and show you the solution, I just wanted to answer a question from the Q&A. Kate was asking how long the project, that Teleporter Adventures project, ran for and how big the team was. The project ran for about 3 to 6 months. The UX team, there were about 3 or 4 of us from the UX side of things, but we actually engaged a production company that was part of the group that we were working with. We also engaged an author. We also engaged an illustrator, as well as some manufacturers to help us make bags and sort of do the printing on the VR headsets themselves. So basically, we were responsible for the end-to-end experience and sort of dove deep where we needed to actually bring that to life. One more question before I reveal which skill is part of the killer framework, and that's from Dave. And he asks, what are some of the great transferable skills for completely different industries? For example, shipping, nursing, and construction, etc. I feel like we're going to get to that when we get into the skills section. So hold that thought and we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, so which skill is part of the killer framework, or what is the killer framework itself? Ta-da! There isn't one. But hopefully when you sort of read what the topic was, I pulled you in like a clickbait, maybe just to see if there was something that you hadn't heard of before, or maybe your curiosity around whether something actually existed or not. And the reason why I did that was deliberate. There's a fellow by the name of Yuval Noah Harari who has authored 3 books chronicling our progress as a species. And this is a quote from his 3rd book, I believe. And he says that humans think in stories rather than in facts, numbers, or equations. And the simpler the story, the better. And the reason why that's super important from a UX design perspective and from a skills perspective is that every time that you present, every time you write a report, every time you're facilitating, every time you're designing, you are telling a story. And that's probably one of the single biggest skills that you can learn as part of a UX designer. So, takeaway number 5, learn how to tell stories. Practice how to tell stories. This takeaway links back to the takeaway 3 about being the user's champion. Because you are the user's champion, your users will become the heroes in the stories that you tell. And as part of this, you're a guide to them. You might be a bit of a hidden guide, but your job as a UX designer is essentially getting them from A to B as seamlessly, as frictionless as possible. Kirk asked a question saying, depending on the scope of the project, is it necessary to do every single process you had on the UX process screen? The short answer is no. You should be flexible in the way in which you approach your projects and the process that you use. But the main thing that you should be doing all the time is checking in with your users as much as possible. If you're in the problem space, you should be thinking about, what is the actual problem you're solving? Is it the right one? What unmet needs do they have? Does the business problem align to the customer problem or the user problem? And then when you're going in the solution space, you should be doing techniques with them as well, the users, to make sure what you're building is the right thing to build. But I guess depending on what it is you're building, whether it's a known domain, the budget you've got, the number of users, the different types of users you might have, that will probably determine which techniques you use, what activities you run. And I guess linked to this particular takeaway, part of the role of a UX designer is often not focusing on the craft of UX design, but telling the stories to the other stakeholders, to people outside of the team, to get them engaged and get them along for the journey. So here's another one. How to deal with difficult stakeholders using the killer skill the best UXers have, but don't share. And I promise it's not a trick, but the way in which you do this is, I guess it comes back to that question that Dave was asking, and it's empathy. So empathy is a skill that can't be shared. It has to be experienced. And it's not to be confused with feeling sorry for someone or really experiencing all their truest emotions, but it is at the core, it's a core soft skill of user experience. Research is all about empathy. But even when you're in solution design itself is empathetic. You're building something to help a user make progress, and you draw on the empathy to make sure what you design is the right thing. So hopefully, Dave, that answer your question. Lawrence asks, besides practicing, do you have a framework that you follow to tell the story better? There's a lot of storytelling frameworks out there. I guess it depends on how story-like you want to be, whether you're trying to be factual, whether you're trying to be emotional. But there's a couple that I could recommend. One of them is probably the hero's journey, which you could use as a very sort of loose framework where you sort of start off on a sort of a medium sort of bit of energy, go into the pit of despair, they sort of come out the other end, sort of triumphant, and that's kind of a framework that I tend to use. Mimi asks, do you have any tips on how to improve our storytelling skills? Short of practicing, I feel like practice is probably the best way to do it. Having said that, you can do, there's a bunch of activities that exist out on the internet. One that I tend to teach to my students when they're coming up to their presentation part of their projects is looking at the content they're trying to get through, and then essentially assigning an energy level to each of those points that they're trying to get through. And then trying to decide, is their presentation more like an action movie where you're kind of hitting the high notes all the time, all the way through, and you're like, oh, sigh of relief at the end, or an end point? Or is it more of a drama where there's more ups and downs, and if you're peppering snippets of information from users throughout that, from the interviews that you've had, or from the qualitative or quantitative research you've completed, you can actually craft a very nice flow, and it feels more like a great story. So that tends to be what I do. Right. Anara asks, can you please give an example of a story you tell to the stakeholders? Not sure I understand 100% what you mean. So, Anara, sometimes you have to explain the work that you're doing to people that don't necessarily understand UX or UX design or aren't part of the project team. They might be people who are from other parts of the business who have no visibility over what you're doing. And so the reason why you tell stories or you present to them is so they understand what it is that you're doing and how they might interact with what you're doing, or ways in which you can work together in the future. Or they might be the folks who own the budget, who need to be shown the value that you're providing to then unlock more budget to make the process continue. Cool. So coming back to this question, how to deal with difficult stakeholders using the killer skill the best UXers have but don't share. So again, a bit of tongue in cheek in terms of the way I framed it. But there's kind of two ways to approach this. So the basic way is, and this is part of that interaction with stakeholders, I've used this hundreds of times in my projects, and it's really hard to refute because it's factual. And so what I would do is, if there's someone talking in like a conference or in like a meeting, and they're at odds with what you're saying, you can refute and say, well, this is what the users said, or this is what the users did. And if it's factual, then not much more can be said about it. Now, the challenge here is you need to make sure you don't get all high and mighty that this is what they said and no. You need to be sort of humble and then work out how collaboratively you can move forwards. Part of this, or a better build on this, is when you can get an aha moment. And this generally happens when you can get some of those stakeholders or people who you need to convince that what you're doing is a good thing, or to get their buy-in. If you get them into a session where you're testing with users or interviewing users, and the user says something that is contradictory, or the interface breaks that they're playing around with, that's when you can get an aha moment. All right, so Diego asks, what should the tone of the story be? I guess it depends on the type of story you're trying to tell, whether you're trying to convince somebody, whether you're trying to, I guess, talk about the users and what it is they're doing. It really depends on what it is you're trying to achieve there. So there's not really a sort of a hard and fast rule to that. By Pi, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, apologies if I'm not, asked, what if the stakeholder didn't even care what the users said? I think there's two parts to this question. One part might be, I don't really care, here's the money, keep going with the project, or great work, keep going, I don't really care. Versus if they are basically taking a stance and sort of wanting to argue with you because they want to be right, or for another reason where they're trying to refute what the user's trying to say. And that actually comes up to the next point, really, which is more of an advanced way to use this particular skill. And that is to get meta. So you'll need to forgive me. You need to imagine I'm Morpheus from The Matrix. And with this one, I've used it a number of times as well. Basically, if someone isn't agreeable with you in a session where you're doing a playback, or you're doing a storytelling process, you can use your UX skills to have empathy for that person. And if you can understand what it is they're trying to achieve, or what they're trying to do, you can use that to work with them. So for example, if an individual was having their feathers ruffled in a meeting, I would find out why that was the case. And on a number of occasions, it's because they wanted to look good in the meetings and didn't really understand what to say or how to sort of sound good in the meeting. So what I would do is I would give that person a pre-brief before that storytelling session with all the other stakeholders, which means that they could then ask a question or make a comment and sound quite intelligent in the room. This also goes all the way up to senior stakeholders. I've called a CEO out on their terrible idea during an ideation session, which is something that I guess junior folks probably would be a little bit adverse to doing. But I understood that this CEO was sick of having all of their comments sort of sugar-coated by agency people. And I called him out on his idea in the session with all of his peers, and I was respectful. And he said afterwards that he valued that feedback and he thought that it helped him make progress. So all stakeholders, irrespective of how junior or senior they are, even C-suite folks, are just human. So if you know what they're trying to achieve and you can use empathy, you can deliver that to them. So the sixth takeaway here is you should be trying to make your empathy your killer skill, because this is the skill that transcends industries. It transcends hard skills, and it's useful day to day. So someone was asking a question before, what skills sort of span across different industries? It's this. If you can empathize with a person, understand what their problems are, understand what their needs are, even in just a conversation, you can then tailor how you talk to them, how you involve them, to make sure that you're sort of working with them to make a good outcome. Right. Shruti asks how to keep the stakeholders engaged with the design process. It's pretty simple. You engage them regularly on a constant basis. So what we tend to do in the projects that I work on is you check in with the majority of your key stakeholders every week. You do a playback session, And the important thing that I found works really well is not to have polished presentations where you're, got shiny designs and all those sorts of things. You're having a very simple conversation saying, here's where we're up to, here's what we found, and here's what we're going to do next. And the reason why that's powerful is because if you're constantly engaging these folks, there are no surprises. There's no ta-da moment at the very end when you deliver something. They're along the journey with you all the way. Right. Ayontika says, how can you do UX work when the project involves specific industry jargon and concepts that are unfamiliar to you? That's a really great question. And if you're doing UX design on the agency side of things, it's challenging because you need to upskill very quickly and start to pick up some of those jargon terms. So there's two ways in which I've done this in the past. One of them is when I design a project sort of scope out, I'll spend a certain amount of time at the beginning to synthesize any existing research. And what you find is if you ask for existing research to synthesize into an output, you start to come across those jargon terms and start to understand how the industry works. And as part of that, you can then, I guess, run stakeholder interviews to get to more depth of it. The other way to get around it is to call in experts who are experts in the field to help work with you. Or often you can embed yourself in the team as well and then rely on the team to help you sort of work through those jargon terms. But it's a really big challenge if you're working on the agency side of things. And even when you're starting a new project. So I'm in week six or seven of my current contract, and there's acronyms flying around left, right, and center. I'm looking up here on my wall, and I've got a list of acronyms that I constantly refer to when people are speaking in sessions. So there's sort of no easy way to get around it, but there certainly are ways to get around it. Okay, so that's the sixth takeaway there. All right, before I move on to this one, I'll answer a question from Samuel. So Samuel asks, when do you get meta with stakeholders, before the presentation or during? When do you usually contact the stakeholder directly? So part of empathy, part of what we do as UX designers is we try to do what's called read the room, which is another soft skill. And if you know ahead of time that there are particular tricky stakeholders in the room, you might try to have a one-on-one with them beforehand. But as part of your presentation, and if I could see your faces now, which I can't, I'd be trying to read your facial expressions to sort of understand who's getting what I'm saying. Am I talking too fast? Do I sound confusing? And if you were a stakeholder who looked a bit grumpy or a bit cranky, I would then probably try to have a one-on-one session with you afterwards, so that moving forwards, I can engage you in the right way. Anara asks, have you ever had issues with IT teams when they say implementation of a certain thing is not possible, although it might be, and how do you handle it? That is a really great question from a digital UX design perspective. I tend to get on well with IT teams because as Chris mentioned at the very beginning, the first half of my career was all technology. So I understand how things work. And so I find that I can push back a little bit and essentially say, well, actually, can't we do it like this, and talk them through it. The best way to get around that is to involve the IT teams up front. So when you're starting to look at problems, you get them engaged in what the actual customer problems or the user problems are. And then when it comes to solution, if you can bring them on that journey, tell the story of the user's problems, they're probably more likely to make more of an effort to see if there are workarounds. And if not, you work with them to work out what the next best opportunity is. So if there's a technological issue where you can't do a certain thing, what's the next best tech option you've got available to you? And the experience might degrade, but it means it's not a hard no, it means it's a slight degrade. So I just want to cover off the best skill that I think is really important from a UX designer's perspective. And it talks to, I guess, being useful for developing solutions, for developing empathy and understanding users, informing sub-skills and techniques like the 5 Whys and Master Apprentice. And it will ensure that you're always learning new things in UX. So the reason why this is a skill that I think is really valuable is that for me, from a young age, I used to like to pull things apart and put them back together again to see how they worked. In the same way, if you apply this skill to people, using empathy, it will help you understand their context and help you empathize with them and know what they're trying to achieve. But I highly encourage you not to pull people apart and put them back together. It could get quite messy. That skill is be curious. If you're curious about how things work, about how people think, about what happens next, then you're always going to be looking at things from different angles. And it could help you see things in different ways. And in terms of a career, you'll always be seeking new things or new ways of looking at problems and building up your skills over time. So why is this such a great skill to add to your toolkit? You can probably sort of see the background of that picture. There's a drawer open and some pens and things in there. And I was working on a project some time ago where we were doing what was called contextual inquiries, which is sitting with a user and watching them use some systems. And we asked this user, how do you log on to this intranet? And this user said, I just log on. And because I was curious, I said, can you show me how? And he said, sure. And so he went to the page he had to get to, typed in his login, typed in his password, hit enter, and he had a login failure. He did this 2 or 3 times. And then after that, he then sort of grunted a bit, reached down, opened up his drawer, and inside his drawer, on top of all of his stationery, was an A4 laminated sheet of every single login, password, and system that he had access to. And there was about 30 or 40 of them on there. And then he methodically went through each one and tried a different login and password with what he thought was the right system. And after about 5 or 6 attempts, he gave up, called the help desk, and they got him to log into his system. Now, why that's really important is that if we hadn't have asked him, if we weren't curious and said, can you show me how it's done? We would have just written down logs onto system. And so that's why being curious is such a great skill to have. Now, of all the skills I've been talking about, they've all been soft skills, not hard skills. And so if we talk about, soft skills, that, empathy and curiosity, and then it's the hard skills like things that occur in research or things that occur in design. Don't get me wrong, hard skills in UX are really important and you need to get the job done. But the reality is that over time, things change. I used to wireframe in a tool called OmniGraffle back in the day. And then I switched to, I think, Visio, then Azure, Sketch, and now I use Figma. I used to handcraft prototypes in HTML, coding up the back end of it in Ruby. And now I fake most of my interactions in tools such as Origami or FramerX. And even interview styles change. Back in the day, we used to do contextual inquiries, then lab-based interviews, then jobs to be done, switch interviews. And now everything's remote. So things keep changing over time. Whereas soft skills tend to stick with you and help build up and approach those types of hard skills. So to summarize and lead into the next section of this webinar, when I'm looking to people when I'm going to be working with, sure, I'm going to be looking at your interim and final outputs so I know you can produce the work, but I'll always be reading between the lines. So how have your projects been messy and how have you responded to that? How have your projects delivered impact and working well with other teams, other stakeholders, and the world? How did you champion the user? How did you find the problem and use it to drive progress? How does your portfolio, resume, or how you describe your projects to me demonstrate your storytelling? How did your empathy amplify the impact that you delivered? And how did your curiosity deliver unexpected results? Now, you can find a plethora of resources online to learn these tools and techniques, but the best place to learn the hard and definitely the soft skills is a live project. Because in a live project or a project that has those elements in it, sometimes you don't know what the solution is going to be. Sometimes the project is very complex. And sometimes you look at your survey results and go, what the? So project-based learning is the best way, hands down, to learn those soft and hard skills. And if you're interested about understanding what skills you currently have, whether it's a soft one or a hard one, the Harness Projects team have a free tool that you can use. I think Chris is going to post this link in the chat. And part of that process is you'll get measured on 25 attitudinal abilities that are the soft skills, and also some of the technical ones, which are the hard. Now, if you're interested in learning more about those sort of 7 takeaways, Sense and Respond is a great book to read about how to sort of unravel when UX projects can be messy. Thinking in systems, a primer helps you understand the bigger picture of how things all hang together. If you're thinking about wanting to know how UX projects should exist outside of isolation. The Jobs We've Done Playbook is an amazing book. It's a pretty recent book if you want to understand how users think and put things together for them. The Right It is an amazing book to quickly get to responses and solutions once you've fallen in love with a problem and you're looking to solve your solutions. If you're trying to understand more about how to tell stories, I would recommend the book by Yuval Noah Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. It's a pretty chunky read, but I recommend having a look at it. If you're wanting to make empathy your killer skill, the one that transcends industries and hard skills, have a look at Observing the User Experience. It's a great book which talks about different ways of exploring how users interact with things and how you can get better at observing them and building that empathy up. And lastly, for anyone who's curious about anything, there's a great website and a couple of books that accompany it called The Great Mental Models, and volume 1 covers off, I think, 10 basic mental models. And what's great about that is that if you know more mental models, it gives you more ways to look at things out in the world and ways to sort of reframe your own thinking. So I've got one more question from Shruti. How to divide the design process between your teammates if you're working for a design solution as a group? That's an interesting question. I feel like it depends. I mean, that's the canonical answer for everything, right? It depends. So if you're working on different parts of the system, you probably want to spend some time together as a group coming up with like a design system of how it all fits together, and then you can kind of divide and conquer. Modern tools such as Figma, and there's a few other ones out there, let you collaborate in real time with each other. I've worked on a Figma project with 6 other designers, and we're all sort of working on different parts of the process of an app at once. So that's a way you can do it. What's starting to happen or has happened, it's probably not too recently, so it's probably been happening for a while, is that in the UX process, which is end-to-end from problem all the way to the delivery, there's a lot of specialisms now. So there's a UX researcher who might sort of focus on doing the research piece up front. Then you've got the designers or the prototypers who might craft those sort of low fidelity prototypes, through to visual designers who make things look amazing. But if it's all coming under that UX umbrella or that UX designer banner, these folks need to be talking to one another and speaking the same language, so that you're not sort of going off on tangents and making things which don't sort of work together. Okay, I have another question from Christine. She asks, how to balance the portfolio between showing to HR or UXers? HRs may want know about the impact numbers and clean process. That's an excellent question. And I feel like the next part of this webinar should answer that, but I'm happy to have a stab now. In some respects, when I put my portfolio together, which isn't online, sorry, I tend to have a bunch of case studies, and I will tweak the way in which those case studies are written and which ways they're delivered, depending on the audience. So when I was talking earlier around different soft skills to have, empathy and these sorts of things, by understanding the progress the HR person is trying to make, by understanding the progress, say the UX hiring person is trying to make, if I'm trying to pitch it into a UXer, I will tweak what I say, how I say it, and in some respects, I tell a different story to those particular types of people to get the impact that I'm looking for. So hopefully that answers your question.